know that the temporal lobe is processing auditory information, and we know that it's also processing visual information, and we know that limbic system structures such as the amygdala are located in the depths here, and another structure, limbic system structure called the hippocampus, is also located in the depths of the temporal lobe. Here we have our temporal lobe, here's the amygdala, here's the hippocampus. The temporal lobes, therefore, subserve a variety of functions, including language, visual spatial functioning, emotional functioning, memory functioning, and in consequence, the temporal lobe, if injured, can give rise to a host of and variety of different problems ranging from severe psychosis, depression, schizophrenia, Wernicke's aphasia, to long-term memory deficits. The temporal lobes, therefore, are extremely important structures involved in all aspects of personal and emotional functioning, as well as higher cognitive functioning such as language and memory. I was on the court's panel of forensic experts for 10 years. I was court appointed to 500 criminal cases, meaning that I could read about somebody doing a horrible crime, and then I could go to the jail and talk to them. It was very fascinating, very interesting to do. Also teaches you about the legal system. Don't get tangled up in that. But in any case, this guy, high school student, getting mostly A's and B's, and a rich family, and he was riding a horse, and the horse started galloping, he lost control, it threw him, he hit his head against the tree, he was unconscious for about 3 weeks. Family member finally bring him home, he starts recovering, and one thing they noticed first off is he would go into his sister's bedroom and expose himself and start masturbating in front of them. And then he'd go into the mother's room and do the same thing. And then he'd start actually trying to have, soliciting his sisters for sex. And this was something he never had done before. And then on the bus going to school, he started actually grabbing females, putting his hand. So he was causing all these kinds of problems. And the problems got worse and worse and worse. The end result was that he beat his mother to death during music lessons while students waited outside, stripped her naked, and had sex with the body after she's dead. So I examined this guy. And the first thing I told the attorney, I go, this guy's got massive, I did some testing. I go, this guy's got massive damage in the right temporal lobe. If you do an MRI, you're going to find most of that temporal area and the amygdala is going to be damaged and destroyed. And if you do EEG, you're going to find all this incredible abnormal activity in that part of the brain. And sure enough, that's exactly what they found. Okay, so what changed this guy's behavior? It's because of damage to these structures. One thing about head injuries, here's the temporal lobe, and here's all this bony structures in here, and the brain is really, if you take the brain out, it's like a bowl of jello. It's very soft tissue, very soft. So you don't want to be shaking your baby, but if you get shook or you get hit, your brain will actually slosh around inside your skull, and that's what causes the damage in the temporal lobe. Look at this little bony structure right here. So you can, it actually, like a cheese grater, will actually tear neocortex. Temporal and inferior frontal lobe, very susceptible to head injury. No matter where the head injury is, these tissues can become damaged, and the temporal lobe can become damaged again by stress. Just being under a tremendous amount of stress can change the biochemistry, can damage those parts of the brain. With right frontal lobe damage, you can get mania, where the person has delusions of grandeur. You can also get delusions of grandeur with temporal lobe damage. Left temporal lobe damage, the person might become massively depressed. Delusions of grandeur are also common in depression. Spoke about left frontal lobe damage, sparing Broca's area. Studies showing that people with depression will show abnormal activity. Damage to the left frontal area, sparing Broca's area, people become depressed. And of course, if they have Broca's aphasia, they're really depressed, and they have good reason to be. But what you get with left frontal damage, that kind of depression, the person's apathetic, the person is blunted. Blunted means dull, so they're not talking too much. They're apathetic, they're depressed. They don't have much thought going on at all, so there's no delusions of grandeur. However, delusions of grandeur do come with a certain type of depression. And that depression is associated with the temporal lobes, the inferior temporal lobes in particular. You get damage in these structures, a person might also have, they're depressed, and they also can have delusions of grandeur, but what they are, instead of, I'm president of the world, it's, I've caused all the misery in the world. I'm the responsible person for all the horrible things that have ever gone on. I'm responsible for all the wars and all the depression. I'm the one who caused all this. And unless the person is George Bush, we know that that's just a joke. Nobody will run to the dean and tell on me. I'm a registered Republican, so that's just a joke. But we know that you can, that's also a form of grandiosity, that I'm the one who caused all the evil in the world. So the person also has delusions of grandeur, but it's in a negative sense. And one of the reasons is because of these structures in the temporal lobe called the amygdala, which is concerned with emotion. One reason they might become massively depressed is because the amygdala is in there and is being damaged, and so the full range of emotions can't be expressed and the person seems depressed, but because the amygdala also controls emotion, the person has depression. If instead your massive damage was here, in the left temporal area, massive damage, you shot in the head, somebody beats you, you have massive blowout of some blood vessels, massive stroke, this area here damages, gets damaged and dies, you would lose the ability to understand anything I'm saying to you. Your ability to understand anything I'm saying would be gone. This is called receptive aphasia. So we know this left temporal area here, when somebody says to you, do you want to go outside? What happens is the information goes into the auditory area, and then it's transferred to Wernicke's area, where it's analyzed, the speech sounds. When I'm talking to you, there are punctuations, temporal sequences in the words. When we read words, we look at there's spaces between them. Even a single word, September, has all these different parts. What happens, this information comes in, stores a little bit of it, analyzes the sequences. Do you want to go outside? Meaning, do you want to go outside? It's the want, outside, go. This area is damaged, you're going to completely lose the ability to understand anything I'm saying to you. And this kind of disorder, it often fools doctors, family members. Sometimes with damage to that area, they might think the patient's become schizophrenic. I'll explain why in a moment. Think they might become psychotic. Here we have again left half of the brain. Left half of the brain. Here's our Broca's area doing the expressive speech. Here's the primary auditory area, analyzes all the sequence of sounds, breaks them apart, sends it to Wernicke's area, which then analyzes the language. And let's say I told you, say after me, I love red pencils. You hear it here, I love red pencils, and the information is actually a fiber bundle, group of axons, bring it to here, and it comes out here. And the mouth area is located here in the motor area. I love green pencils, or whatever color I said, and then you can repeat it. If this area is destroyed, every bit of information it transmits is also going to be abnormal. But if it starts talking, it's going to say a lot of nonsense. This is a patient I examined, and this is them, I recorded them talking during the examination, and this is them talking. A bunch of good gogging. If you keep reading here, when they brought this patient in, he's talking like this all the time. And they thought maybe he's schizophrenic. Maybe developed schizophrenia. He's saying all this bizarre stuff because even when you would talk to him and try to explain to him that what he's saying, he's not responding to what's being said to him. He had Wernicke's aphasia. He had a massive stroke in Wernicke's area, so suddenly all this, when he's talking, it's just nonsense. This is called fluent aphasia. Receptive aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, can also give rise to fluent aphasia, so whatever you're saying is nonsense. And again, you can't tell the person, hey, you know, you didn't make any sense? Oh, one part of sparks bears walked on the left on arm. I'm just going to say the word, you don't have to learn it today. It's called agnosia. Agnosia, nausea, G-N, nausea, Gnostic means to know. Agnosia means not to know. Phasia, phonate, aphasia, not to. Okay? Agnosia. What this means, a person with Wernicke's aphasia, with damage in this area, that doesn't understand anything that you're saying, because this area analyzes language, it doesn't know that it doesn't know. It doesn't know that it's not understanding. It doesn't know that, because this is the area of the brain that analyzes language. So the person is trying to have a conversation, they're not going to know anything's wrong with them. Language, thought, most of us think in words. You might also think in images. You might also think in sounds. Musician, you might think in musical chords. Some people visual images, some all of the above. But a lot of you, when you're thinking, you might hear a dialogue in your head. You hear these words, you're actually thinking it. You hear your thoughts. So your thoughts, insofar as they're related to language, obviously are using this pathway. I gave you an example of a person with Wernicke's aphasia. The clapped big dog was over by the rabbit and over on the good goggin. Well, there's damage in this area. I told you all earlier, left temporal lobe damage and right temporal lobe damage can give rise to depression. I told you all earlier, left temporal lobe damage is also associated with schizophrenia. With left frontal damage, you can also get schizophrenia, but it's a different kind of schizophrenia. The person's not talking, the person's not functioning, the person might have weird mannerisms and be holding certain postures, catatonic schizophrenic. But a person with temporal lobe damage, particularly left temporal lobe damage, also can develop schizophrenia. And there's plenty of studies showing that schizophrenics, people with schizophrenia, have damage in this area. There's different types of schizophrenia, okay? But one type we know is associated with a formal thought disorder. If you're taking abnormal psychology, they would teach you that schizophrenia is associated with a formal thought disorder. Why would that be? Well, there's all this language area. And if you have damage to the temporal lobe, it's going to disturb your thinking, at least thinking in words. And it's going to, a formal thought disorder, a person with schizophrenia, particularly left temporal lobe schizophrenia, this person's talking, they're not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. They will be having with the God one was with the, the bird was, and it's just really that way. What? What did they? Didn't make any sense. It's almost like a Wernicke's aphasia. We call it a formal thought disorder, and not surprisingly, if you have abnormalities, you have damage in this area, particularly if you have seizure disorder, some forms of epilepsy, not surprisingly, the person might develop a formal thought disorder because the language part of the brain is abnormal. Another feature of schizophrenia is hallucinations. And commonly, those hallucinations are most often auditory hallucinations. A person's going to hear voices, and the voices are going to be telling them things, like, why don't you go put your head in the oven and kill yourself, or why don't you go to school and shoot all those people plotting against you. Some people hear women's voices, and it's a man. Some people hear multiple voices telling them to do things, telling them bad things. You're the worst person in the world, telling them things like that. They hear these voices. Some studies show that when schizophrenics hearing voices show activity in Broca's area and in Wernicke's area. Well, where in the world would the voice be coming from if not within their own head? So not surprisingly, if you have some type of abnormality, the person might be hearing a voice because they're hearing it in the temporal lobe. That's where you would be hearing it. And if you have abnormalities in the temporal lobe, not surprisingly, you might hear sounds and voices. In fact, we know that even a person who's not schizophrenic, you can go in and stimulate, for example, in this area. If you stimulate this part of the brain, or if there's a tumor growing in there, that's the primary auditory receiving area. If there's a tumor growing in this region, or seizure activity, abnormal activity, a person might hear very simple hallucinations. You might hear like footsteps, crackling noises, something like radio background sound, again like whispering. And that can cause problems wherever you're sitting in your room reading. Who's doing that? Okay, so not surprisingly, some people with schizophrenia. Well, we would see Broca's area lighting up. In fact, some studies will actually, looking at EMG, motor muscular activity, schizophrenics, when they say they're hearing voices, will actually see the vocal cords are actually moving, meaning that they're producing it. And some schizophrenics, the worst ones, the ones who most wear off, the most worst off, hear the voices outside their head. These are the people that are really in bad shape, because the ones that hear it in their head might recognize it's in their head, whereas outside, did you hear that? Why didn't you hear it? That person is, and then you're claiming you don't hear it, they know you hear it. Okay? So sometimes they hear it in their head, sometimes they hear it outside their head, but then there's the question of why might they hear it? Why don't they hear their own voice? They might hear other people's voices. They might hear male, female, they might hear the voice of God telling them to do something, or the devil telling them to do something. If you move into this area, into the association area and stimulate, or if there was abnormal activity, a person might actually hear words or sentences. They might hear voices. They hear somebody talking. If instead they turned the temporal lobe over and looked at the right temporal lobe, and you stimulated the association area, a person will hear music. They might hear complex musical sounds. They might hear birds singing or wind blowing. So the two temporal lobes differ in that the left temporal lobe abnormalities in the auditory areas is both either one. The primary, you're going to get simple auditory hallucinations, where if you move to the association area, the left, you're going to hear complex, like words, phrases, sentences, or you move to the right temporal area, you might hear musical passages. What this tells us is that words, sentences, actually stored in the left and right temporal lobe. For example, most of you right now have the ability, if you thought of a musical, some music you heard, you could actually hear it playing in your head. I mean, you have your own little iPod right there in your head, so you can hear phrases of music. Sometimes, it happens to some people, they hear something musical, and then for the rest of the day he's playing and playing and playing, they can't make it stop. That's not necessarily due to abnormal activity, but what that tells us is that this circuit, this area, for some reason continues to fire, so you continue to hear that musical passage. So memories are actually stored in the temporal lobe. We know in the parietal lobe, body image memories are stored, but when we go into the temporal lobe, it's different kind of memories being stored in that part of the brain. The left temporal lobe is processing lots of auditory information, and it turns out that in this part of the temporal lobe, it's storing auditory, verbal memories. My name, Dr. Joseph, is being stored in your left temporal lobe. The name of the street you live on is stored here. Sentences, things you read in a book, conversations you're having. All auditory, linguistic, verbal type information is being stored in the left temporal lobe. And there's two structures in here involved in memory. One of them is called the amygdala. We've talked before about that. Emotional memory. Another structure called the hippocampus, which also involved in memory. But in consequence, if you had damage in this area, you would have severe problems with verbal memory. I could say to you, give you your assignment, you could read things, in a few minutes you start forgetting all that information. Okay, so the temporal lobe is storing all this auditory information. Okay, whereas the left temporal lobe is storing auditory, verbal, narrative information. In other words, what you read, what you hear, anything that has verbal, mathematical qualities to it. The right half of the brain, and the right temporal lobe, is storing visual information. Visual, spatial, such as where you might have left your car keys, how to get from point A to B, how to find your way to San Francisco without street signs, where you put your clothes the other day, where the location of objects are, where you left your clothes the other day and your golf clubs. All this information is stored by the right half of the brain, and in particular the right temporal lobe. So the right temporal lobe stores visual information and spatial information and pictorial information and imaginal information and facial information. So it's storing faces, the faces of people that you meet, where you've been, where you left your car, where you met that person the other day. You can remember the way to the dentist's office. So whereas the left temporal lobe would be remembering what street your dentist is on, the right temporal lobe would remember what the dentist looked like, what his office looked like, where it's located, how to get there, and also maybe how much you don't want to go see the dentist. This is made possible by structures such as the amygdala and the hippocampus taking short-term memories and placing those short-term memories into long-term memories, and those long-term memories, both verbal and visual, are being stored in the right and left temporal lobe. And the hippocampus interacts with the amygdala, so that the amygdala is also storing the emotional attributes of what was experienced. So, temporal lobe structures are in turn dependent upon the amygdala and the hippocampus, and these two structures are interacting and are taking short-term memories, placing them into long-term memories, and the amygdala simultaneously is surveying the environment to find objects and animals and individuals, food items, anything of emotional significance. And what is of emotional significance, the amygdala would be storing that into long-term memory, whereas the hippocampus would be storing where that object or person or item is located, etc. and so on. It is these long-term memories stored by the amygdala and the hippocampus within the temporal lobe which serves as the depository and the source from which fabric of dreams are woven, and from which hallucinations have their source. In other words, there are feature detectors located in the temporal lobe, and there's feature detectors located in the amygdala and the hippocampus, and when those structures are abnormally activated, a person might see faces, they might see what they perceive to be ghosts or complex hallucinations, and those hallucinations can also include items and experiences from memory. Likewise, dreams can also draw from these depositories of memories and experiences stored in the temporal lobe by these two structures, and when the temporal lobes are activated, not surprisingly, these experiences also find their way into dreams. In consequence, if the right temporal lobe is injured or damaged, the person is going to have trouble remembering where they left their car keys, maybe where they parked their car, where their clothes are. In other words, right temporal lobe damage is going to result in severe visual spatial memory deficits. A person is going to have trouble finding their way around town without street signs, even finding their way home. They might have trouble recognizing friends, might have trouble recognizing their own house or their own mother or wife or sister or brother, because all this information is also being stored in the right temporal lobe. So right temporal lobe damage severely disrupts all aspects of visual, spatial, imaginal memory. is we know that the temporal lobe is processing auditory information, and we know that it's also processing visual information. Visual cortex. Primary area, simple percepts. Association area, more complex percepts. But it turns out if you start going into this area, extremely complex percepts, including, for example, faces. Here they might have neurons that recognize a certain spot. Over here, ones that respond to circles. Over here, ones that respond to squares. But you get down into this area, you have neurons that respond to specific features. There might be neurons that respond just to eyes. If it sees eyes, it'll fire. If it sees a nose, another neuron will fire. Another one to the mouth. In the left half of the brain, there are neurons specialized for recognizing faces. And if we're communicating, talking to people, have friends or baby or family, it's important to be able to recognize their face. So this area of the brain has all these specialized neurons for recognizing complex objects, including faces. But the left half of the brain, think about language, temporal sequences, rhythmic patterns, portions, pieces, parts. Same thing with face. There are some neurons here and in the amygdala and in the hippocampus that recognize entire faces, but predominantly the left half will recognize parts of faces. There are neurons that recognize just parts of faces. However, the right half in the temporal area also has neurons that will respond to eyes, lips, noses, but it's the right temporal area which recognizes entire faces. Entire faces. In consequence, if this area of the brain is injured, particularly a region of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, if this area of the brain is damaged, individuals will lose the ability to recognize faces, a disorder called prosopagnosia, a complete inability to recognize faces, faces of friends, of lovers, of one's pets. Farmers lose the ability to recognize Bessie and their own cows. People with damage in this area not only have difficulty recognizing faces, but they might come to believe that their family members have been replaced by imposters. Not surprisingly, it can give rise to severe psychiatric disturbances, including paranoia. The paranoia can be based not only on the belief that family members look different, but with the right temporal lobe damage, it might also affect the ability to perceive social emotional nuances, including vocal features. That is, the patient might believe not only does my mom, my wife, my children look different, but they sound different. They sound different, they look different, and so not surprisingly, a person might become severely emotionally disturbed, as well as incredibly paranoid. Conversely, if these areas of the brain become abnormally activated, people might seem familiar when they're not. They might start seeing people as looking like family members when there's no relationship. In fact, people might actually begin to hallucinate family members or faces or complex objects, and in fact, stimulation, abnormal activity to the right hemisphere can give rise to incredibly complex visual hallucinations. Back in the 1950s, scientists by the name of Penfield, what would happen, Penfield's going to go in and remove a tumor, but he would spend hours and hours and hours stimulating different parts of the brain to hear what they might experience. And here he's actually putting labels on the brain. And what would happen, he'd be stimulating a different area. A person goes, I hear my mother calling me. Stimulate another area. I hear a dog barking. Stimulate another area. I see a butterfly. I see a butterfly flying across the room. Stimulate another area. I remember, I see in front of me the time when I was 7 years old and I fell in the swimming pool. And I remember I can see it right now. In other words, stimulating the brain, in the temporal lobe in particular, caused neurosurgical patients to have vivid hallucinations which were related to memory. So again, we're being told different memories are being stored in the neurons in the temporal lobe, and by stimulating these different areas of the brain, a person would have all these experiences. However, a number of neurosurgeons stimulating the brain have found that people will recall memories that they hadn't thought of in years, including things from their childhood. So we know all these memories are being stored in there. Now, yes?
How do you determine whether it's real memory or hallucination?
Well, that was one of the questions that came up from Penfield's work, is some of the people said it really wasn't a memory, had no memory, it was just they conjured up the experience right there. On the other hand, Penfield doing these stimulations, people would not just hear, but they'd see things. Visual cortex, as we said, you moved up into the parietal area, lower visual field to watch the body, but visual processing continues into the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is looking at the upper visual fields. So the temporal lobes are always watching the upper visual field, whereas the parietal lobe is watching the lower visual field. Simple cells, complex cells, hypercomplex cells, where you actually see shapes. You get into this area, the person will see complex objects, persons, people. Person with the tumor, seizure disorder, electrical stimulation, they will have incredibly vivid hallucinations. They'll see devils, they'll see God, they will see angels, they'll see dress, they will see pigs dressed as people walking around in high heels. Incredibly vivid, powerful hallucinations. And the more and more you move towards the anterior temporal lobe, where that amygdala and the anterior hippocampus, anterior main front, hallucinations get incredibly more and more and more profoundly vivid as you move anterior to the temporal lobe. So if you're dealing with a patient, for example, this is a guy I saw about 5 years ago. He had incredibly powerful visual hallucinations. He told me that he saw the entire cast of Friends would appear on his kitchen table in miniature. Yeah. So he doesn't even need cable. But he said, and they would entertain him, so he could sit there and while I was talking to him, he was able to identify some. He said, they're right there now. Do you see them? And I go, yeah. Because I wanted to hear more. The last thing you want to do if you're going to be good at this job is tell somebody, there's nothing there. Then they're not going to talk to you anymore. Stimulation in this area, micropsia, micro, small, or mac, huge. So this guy is telling me he sees the entire cast of Friends. They'd appear every night, and they would entertain him, tell him jokes, and those were his hallucinations. Another patient told me that God would appear to him in the nude. Yeah, so God would appear naked to him and would give him advice on what he should be doing with his life. Another patient, abnormalities in this region, told me that he saw the angel Gabriel would appear. And what would happen is Gabriel would appear about once a week, and he'd see Gabriel's foot coming right through the house. And he could go outside and see the angel Gabriel, foot on one mountain, a foot on another mountain, extending miles into the air, stretched out. How do you know it's the angel Gabriel? Well, it just is. So incredibly powerful hallucinations. Visual cortex, as we said, you moved up into the parietal area, lower visual field to watch the body, but visual processing continues into the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is looking at the upper visual fields. So the temporal lobes are always watching the upper visual field, whereas the parietal lobe is watching the lower visual field. Upper visual field. What do we associate with the upper visual field? I could say God or angels. The more and more you move towards the anterior temporal lobe, where that amygdala and the anterior hippocampus, anterior main front, hallucinations get incredibly more and more and more profoundly vivid as you move anterior. Incredibly complex visual hallucinations are more common with right temporal lobe than with left. All studies looking at tumors, seizure disorders, Penfield studies, other neurosurgeons go in and stimulate, they find that the right temporal lobe produces the most profound, incredibly profound hallucinations. Some people, so you have people seeing all kinds of incredible complex scenes, including religious figures, like you say, God, or angels, or devils, or ghosts. Upper visual field. What do we associate with the upper visual field? The heavens. A person with schizophrenia is hallucinating. They're more likely to be having auditory than with visual. If they're having both, they're in incredibly bad shape. When you dream at night, every night you dream. When you're asleep, you dream. Even if you have no memory of that dream, you're dreaming. You're having numerous dreams all night long. In fact, you'll dream about, and I'll go into more detail when we talk about the brainstem, but you'll dream about every 90 minutes. And when you start dreaming, you go into what's called paradoxical sleep. Paradoxical, they call it paradoxical because activity in the brain is as if you were totally awake. So it's called paradoxical because the person looks completely awake while they're dreaming. And you get, during paradoxical sleep, you see increased activity in the brainstem, but you also see increased activity in the occipital lobe, and you also see increased activity in the right temporal lobe, but not in the left. Now, I'll get to you in a moment. What also happens during dreaming is the eyes will start moving. It's called rapid eye movement. And some people, realistic movie, you'll know the person's dreaming because you see the eyes moving back and forth. So when you go into paradoxical sleep, when you're dreaming, you also get what's called rapid eye movements. Your eyes are moving back and forth, as if you're actually watching the dream. And that's called rapid eye movement. Rapid eye movement, also called REM. Rapid, R-I-E, movement, M, REM. Called REM sleep. So it just so happens that you get incredibly complex visual hallucinations with right temporal lobe damage or seizure activity or excessive stimulation. And it also turns out that dreaming activity is associated with an incredible amount of activity in the right temporal lobe. During non-REM, there's more activity in the left half of the brain. So it's like the two brains, and this actually goes on all day. It's too bad we didn't. There's just so much we could talk about. But the two halves of your brain actually oscillate in activity all day long, and it continues into the evening.
Vu type hallucination?
Deja vu is also associated with temporal lobe abnormalities. Yeah, and in fact, the stimulation studies as well, people would have deja vu. Stimulate, you know, you just did that. I just had that experience. There can be several reasons for deja vu. Much more common during childhood. And one reason it's much more common during childhood is that the brain is still immature. Connections haven't been made. Not all connections. And so one belief is that you have the experience, and that experience could be in different parts of the brain, and that it's actually transmitted twice to the same area. So you go, you know, I just did that, and I just said that before, and you just did that before. I've had this experience. When? I don't know. It's called deja vu. So one belief is that neurons, because they're immature, that the person is getting the same message twice, or there's a delay. So instead of the messages being received in the same area simultaneously, you receive it and then there's a millisecond delay. So you go, you know, I just had that experience before. So that feeling of familiarity. It appears to happen, deja vu, less and less as you get older. So I hardly, myself, have it at all, whereas when I was a kid, it seemed like continually having over and over and over again the same experiences. So that would relate to the idea of maturity of the brain. Another possibility is that both halves of the brain are having an experience. They communicate by the corpus callosum, that band of fibers crossing over. The corpus callosum takes over 10 years to mature. So what might happen is that when you're an adult, the two halves can share simultaneously, whereas you're a child, there might be a delay going across. So the person goes, oh, you know, I just had that experience. In any case, deja vu is also associated with temporal lobe, immature temporal lobe, and with temporal lobe abnormalities. And if any of you are having deja vu, it does not mean you have an abnormality in your brain. It's also a very common experience.
I wanted to ask this when you were talking about paradoxical sleep. Is that the same thing as lucid dreaming?
Lucid dreaming is when you know that you're dreaming and you try to control the dream. Right. And I've had that unique experience several times. It's something like, I'm dreaming now, so now I'm going to try to do, but then...
Do what?
Well...
What are you?
As we know, sometimes when you have dreams, you might fly through the air. I used to have those great dreams all the time when I was a kid. You start running, and next thing you know, you're flying and soaring over everything. Am I the only one who had that dream? One other issue quickly about dreams before we move on is dreams actually only last a few seconds. You might think it's going on for hours. It's only going on for a few seconds. And also, often we dream backwards. Dreams often do not make any sense because they're not organized in a temporal sequential manner, because what half of the brain organizes information in temporal sequences? The left. The right sees gestalts, sees the whole picture. So a dream can also be where it's completely convoluted. One moment you're talking to the handsome guy or beautiful lady, and next you're eating dinner, and then you're riding a horse. And famous dream. This guy has this dream that he's back during the French Revolution, and he's arrested, and he's tried, and he's convicted, and he's marched down the street, and there's a yelling, screaming crowd, happy to see another person getting their head chopped off, and he's feeling all this fear and anxiety, and he's marched up to where they chop the heads off, all the way up, puts his head on the block. Thing comes down, he feels it hits his neck, at which point he wakes up, and what happened is that his poster bed had broke, and part of the poster had hit him across the neck. So the question then becomes, okay, did the dream somehow lead up to that? No. What happened is that the dream is almost instantaneous, and what happened is that he was in the process of dream when he felt that hit the neck, and like closure, world power, the blind spot, confabulation filling the gap, the right hemisphere created a dream to explain what that sensation was. You can dream backwards, and dreams can be almost instantaneous. Yes?
Is that like when your alarm clock goes off and then you dream that you're...
Have a complex dream leading up to it, right, yeah. And what's happening is the alarm clock, or somebody's knocking the door, ringing the door, you have this complex dream leading up to it. No, the dream was almost instantaneous. And so it's a whole different world with dreams.